No government, no glory. Housing expert Olu Olariwaju joins the Flywheel Economics Affordable Housing mini-series with a bold message. Without strong government, capable institutions, and coherent policy, affordable housing at scale is just wishful thinking. Drawing from groundbreaking initiatives in Rwanda and his global experience, Olu makes it clear effective housing solutions start from the top. Welcome to the Flywheel Economics podcast. Flywheel Economics is a concept that proposes true, sustainable economic growth by viewing economies as ecosystems. I'm your host, Richard O.
And I'm your co-host, Favor Ogbadu. Together, let's explore a more sustainable and powerful way to view innovation, investment, and economic policymaking.
Welcome to the Flywheel Economics podcast, and we're back with another episode from our affordable housing mini-series. Favor, it's good to be back. It's good to be back on the affordable housing mini-series. Give us a bit of a recap. What have the audience heard so far from this mini-series?
Yes, it's really good to be back with episode 5 of our affordable housing mini-series. In our first
5?
Yes.
5 already?
5.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
In our first episode, we sat down with Ian Shapiro, the CEO of Real, which was a scene-setting episode where we explored the current realities of the affordable housing ecosystem and what we would need in order to scale. And then for episode 2, we were with Sumeda Naik, CEO of Syntellect. And in that episode, we discussed Right Profile, that is an innovation of Syntellect, which uses AI and machine learning to open up mortgage opportunities for the unbanked and people in the informal sector. Now, episode 3 was another hard-hitting episode that saw us sitting down with Simon Wally. He's a lead financial sector specialist with the World Bank. And for that episode, we focused on different aspects of affordable housing financing, including the affordability dimensions, which was really cool. And then for episode 4, which is our most recent episode so far, we explored a fascinating topic, which is how blockchain technology intends to create an alternative route towards financing in the affordable housing ecosystem. And Glenn Jordan, the CEO of Empower, was our guest. And today is episode 5, as I said, which is really exciting. And for me, so far, it's been a really insightful experience where we have gotten to learn and explore the affordable housing puzzle, encompassing the pieces, players, and solutions. In fact, it's going so well. I think we should do a spin-off. Should we do a spin-off?
Oh, I think there's always room for spin-offs. What were you thinking, Favor?
How about music or something creative?
Well, look, I'm open to ideas, but before we go on to the new horizons for a mini-series, let's have a little bit of a think about where this episode is going to sit in the affordable housing mini-series. Because with this one, it's a little bit different in its focus. Because in a lot of the other episodes, we've tried to look at ways around problems, right? We've looked at things like how do you bring the informal sector to get mortgages? How do you use blockchain technology in order to enable pay and installment type mortgages, pay as you go mortgages? How do you have these kind of clever workarounds? But we haven't really focused yet on one of the most central players, if not the most central player in all of this, government. And I think one of the lovely things about having our guest today is that we really go deeply into looking at what the role for government is in trying to take affordable housing to scale. And that's really what this is all about. How do we unlock affordable housing at scale? So tell us a bit about our guest, Favor.
Today, we sit down with Olu Olariwaju. He is a director at Altair, which is based in the UK. And it's really exciting, this episode with Olu, because he really takes a deep dive into considering the implications of governments, institutions, and policies. Just as you said, realizing that innovation, there's always going to be room for innovation in the affordable housing sector, but that can never be a strong enough substitute for things like the policies and governments?
Well, let's have a listen to what he has to say.
Okay, thank you, Richard and Favor, for the invite to speak about my favorite subject, affordable housing. My name is Oluwalanwaju, and I'm part of the team at Altair, where I lead the international work of Altair on affordable housing and infrastructure advisory. We work mostly across Africa and other emerging markets. My particular role sits at what I call the intersection of policy, finance, and institutional capacity building. And we generally help governments, agencies, municipal authorities, private sector institutions, and development partners we help them to turn their sort of big ambitions of expansion of affordable housing into what are called practical, scalable housing solutions. Altair, to some extent, the history of Altair in various guises is that we were set up around 35 odd years ago under a different name in order to support the transition of the um, public sort of non-for-profit institutions in the UK to move into more privately financed sector. And over that period, over 100 billion of private capital has gone into the financing of affordable housing. So to sum up, actually, in terms of my role, we're definitely passionate about expansion of affordable housing, and we're very keen to support emerging countries in addressing the housing crisis and making cities more inclusive and sustainable.
Thank you, Olu. So what motivated you about all of this? Why did you want to get into affordable housing? And also, we're trying to focus a little bit around the institutional reform that's required. So why are you also interested in not just affordable housing, but also that institutional reform that's required as well?
Okay, I think like most people that I've come across in housing or affordable housing, like most people, you stumble into it. And in my case, I entered the field of affordable housing um, and sort of realizing how profound it is in terms of its impact on people's health, education, livelihoods, and dignity. So, but a quick sort of just to give you to answer your question more specifically. Although I was born in England, I spent my formative years in Nigeria after my parents returned there in back to Nigeria in the early 70s. So I completed my first degree in Nigeria and I studied geography, urban and regional planning. When I got back to England, it was just in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, where there was a sort of economic recession. And the only sector in the UK, because it was then designed in a way that is counter-cyclical, was the affordable housing sector that had a sort of large injection of resources from government to stimulate the market. So I got into like a training program that provided access to affordable housing sector because I just wanted to get into property. But like I said earlier, and in getting into the affordable housing sector in the UK, it allowed me to gain the necessary experience to qualify as a chartered planning and development surveyor. And early in my career, I worked on development and regeneration initiatives, and I just witnessed firsthand how stable, decent housing is crucial for communities and families to thrive. And with respect to institutional reform, I sort of my sort of passion about it stemmed from during my sort of various role in the housing sector, the housing association sector in the UK. I ended up undertaking an MBA and attained that created sort of provided a route to senior management roles. But what that sort of um, helped me to quickly understand is that there was, beyond constructing homes, it was necessary to address the underlying systems associated with housing, which are systems around land, systems around finance, governance, and policy. So I quickly realized that institutional reform was vital in this context. And the other reason that I'm attracted to it is that having drawn lessons from my experience in the UK, where there's a longer history of affordable housing, you recognize the importance of institutions that have been created. And by no means, let me correct anybody, and by no means am I saying that the UK housing system is perfect, as we all know, but nonetheless, there are a lot to learn from its failures and sometimes institutional failures as well. And that's why, but one thing that is very clear is that you quickly grasp the understanding that without strong policy and institutions, it is impossible to address the complex and systemic nature of affordable housing.
Thank you so much, Olu. It's really inspiring to hear your response about coming into the affordable housing sector and listening to your inspiration. So from your perspective, why is the role of institutions and coherent housing policy particularly crucial in emerging economies, especially in Africa?
Oh, thank you for that question. I mean, there's a long list, but I'll just try and make it short and snappy. Of course, I think we all are quite aware that in Africa, there's a rapid urbanization. I mean, Africa is urbanizing faster than any other region, as we're talking. Hundreds or thousands of people are moving into new cities, and I think maybe millions every year. I think there are projections by that 2050, 7 out of the 10 largest cities will be located in Africa. So with that sort of rapid urbanization, you need strong institutions and clear policies. Because if you don't, obviously urban growth becomes unplanned and informal, and obviously, and it leads to the challenges we have at the moment of slums and poor infrastructure and social inequality. Linked to that is the backlog. I mean, there's a significant backlog in terms of addressing housing deficits. There's huge housing gap in many African countries, in the millions of units that needs to be built. So having coherent policies that is implemented helps to set standards, help to attract and coordinate investment. And the example I think I mentioned when I was introducing myself was in the UK, where government, led by the then Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, had a clear policy of wanting to reduce public sector investment in affordable housing, but at the same time, we're keen to attract private capital from the capital markets to fund the gap. In order to do that, they set up a coherent policy framework, including a regulatory framework, where it was needed to provide assurance to investors. So that's an example of where the policy was designed, was properly executed, but with a clear objective of trying to attract capital investment. And that's a good example of where policy and institution intertwine to address this. So creating enabling regulatory frameworks, I think, builds investor confidence and also lower risks. The other thing why policies and institutions are crucial in emerging economies is that, as we all know, and I've listened to some of your podcasts, there's a consistent theme about the challenges of housing finance in Africa that remains underdeveloped and often unaffordable. So if you're going to sort of attract and mobilize finance, then you need to create institutions that play a key role in developing mortgage markets, or in some cases, encouraging housing microfinance or rent-to-own schemes or large-scale rental. So those will be some few points. I mean, the other point that just occurred to me whilst I was reflecting is that with the whole issue around climate change impacting African cities, whether it's flooding or heat waves, um, we need to start building housing that are resilient and energy efficient. But you would definitely need institutions and policies to enforce the necessary standards, to develop the green building codes, to build capacity, and to promote sustainable construction technologies. So those would be some of the points where I think policies and institutions are needed. And ultimately, also, as you well know, you also then need housing. We know that housing drives the economies, the local economies, to create jobs and construction. You need institutions to help structure housing as a productive investment.
Thank you, Olu. I building on that, you've mentioned to us previously about a disconnect between the big policy announcements and what actually then happens on the ground with the houses developed. What do you think's going wrong here? Why, when the ambition is so high, do we get so little actual delivery on affordable housing, whether in the UK, whether in Nigeria, whichever, Rwanda, whichever country? Why is there such a big disconnect?
Okay, thanks. I mean, I hope it's not controversial because I think it's something that we all experience. And like you rightly said, it's not something unique to Africa. In the UK is a good example where the government has made huge announcements about building 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years. But quite clearly, everybody knows that the capacity is not there to deliver that. I mean, we don't have the construction capacity. We don't have some of the technology. But everybody, but nonetheless, those announcements are made. Nor do we have the funding allocation to sustain that number of units. Your question is, why does that happen? I think there's always that gap between political rhetoric and institutional capacity. Um, Inevitably, politicians announce large housing targets, sometimes for political gain, sometimes for visibility. But the reality is that these targets often ignore the technical, financial, and regulatory realities needed to deliver at scale. It's well known across Africa, especially where I do bulk of my work. Implementing institutions, maybe ministries, local government agencies, often lack the capacity, the autonomy of funding to follow through. The other thing that at times is always missing is actually not enough analysis of the weaknesses of the housing value chain to understand. We've been because I'm sure in every country across Africa there will have been a lot of these announcements that have been made, and nobody has ever bothered to say, look, actually over the last 5 or 10 years or 20 years, we've been making all these pronouncements. Why have we failed? Why has it not worked? And a lot of it will boil down to the weaknesses within the housing value chain or ecosystems, as you may call it. The other reason, in my view, is also the underfunding and the uncoordinated delivery systems. Budgets are rarely allocated in full. Sometimes it arrives late, it's irregular. But more importantly for me, there's this poor coordination between ministries, local government, and all the actors in the housing value chain. And the other point linked to this is generally these announcements are normally made without the necessary planning of how actually these numbers are going to be delivered. And I may say that I don't want to use the term competence, but I think there's an issue about actually. I don't know, was it Donna Rumsfeld that says you don't know what you don't know or something of that nature? But I think if you've never delivered large scale housing, the numbers people are talking about, and you've not experienced it, I think it's at times it's very difficult. And I worked my last before I moved into consultancy. My last corporate job was working with an organization that was building 1,000 homes a year. I know the infrastructure and the systems and the people and the capabilities and the challenges and the financing required to build 1,000 units every year. And I just don't see that level of sophistication or expertise in some of my travels across Africa. Then the other reason where there's a gap, I think I've mentioned it, is also the fact that there's all these reliance on PPP, which I'm sure you've heard several times. But the reality is that housing PPPs are really successful, or there's not a long list of successful PPP projects. So, but what normally happens is that there's a reliance on private sector to provide affordable housing, but without the necessary incentives being put in place to provide either whether it's subsidies, service land, or tax breaks. And the reality is that private developers will migrate to pursue projects or projects that are more profitable. That's just the nature of the beast. The private sector doesn't show up for low-income housing without proper risks sharing mechanisms. So those are some of the examples, but there are other things like weak governance and political interference or weak data, and as I mentioned before, planning.
Really interesting, Olu. And you mentioned delivery just a few minutes ago in your answer. And I think saying that affordable housing delivery is complex is an understatement. But in the light of that, who do you believe should ideally coordinate the housing ecosystem? Is it government, private sector, NGOs, or multi-stakeholder coalitions? And why?
Okay, I think it's a very straightforward answer. I think it's the government really, because the government has the mandate and the authority. Now, when I say the government, I will still then put some caveat on it, but it does have the mandate and authority to do that, to play that role, because it's probably the most significant entity that impact on the housing ecosystem. And I know a bit reference the ecosystem a lot, but what do I mean by that? The housing value chain consists of different activities like land, like finance, like planning, regulatory regime, like the macroeconomy, all these sort of the private sector participation and all that. So the government has a sort of greater influence on how the ecosystem functions than anybody else. And that's why I think it should play a role as a lead coordinator. I don't think the government can deliver it on its own. There are rare examples where government has delivered housing mainly on its own. And that rare example is probably Singapore, which is seen as one of the most, I suppose, consistent government public sector approach to deliver housing. But I don't think most African countries have the sort of resources or the discipline that Singapore has as the way Singapore has approached housing delivery and some of the cultural element that goes into that. So in my view, it's the government that should be the lead coordinator, and the reasons are because it's able to set clear housing policy and vision. It's probably most influential in terms of enabling land access and also in terms of administration of land, in terms of titling or allocation or bringing in service plot into the housing delivery system. It's responsible for creating regulatory frameworks to ensure that all the actors um, deliver, whether it's in terms of regulation, in terms of tenancy laws, or regulation in terms of finance, or regulation in terms of green agenda, the government is probably best placed to put those things in place and to ensure accountability and quality control. So that would be my reasons why I think the government is best place to do that.
Thank you, Olu. So I'm interested in your experience over the years. You must have seen a number of examples of where this has gone well and where these kind of things haven't gone so well. It would be great to get some of those practical examples that illustrate effective or ineffective coordination of the housing policies. So go on then, spill the beans.
Okay. Don't forget, I'm a consultant, and so I need to be very careful in terms of my clients. But what I generally say is that in terms of where coordination has worked best, and also I must say that I'm also a passionate researcher of housing policies and housing systems. I'll probably say Austria, especially Vienna, is a good example where you see a very clear, long-standing, coordinated approach, whereby I think in Vienna, nearly 60% of the population lives in one, well, I won't say affordable, but a sort of government initiated via non-for-profit institutions, public housing. Similar, I think I've mentioned Singapore as well as an example of, I would say, a housing system that works and works for the population at large. Without being specific, I think a lot of emerging countries, and I think one has to be extremely careful in being too critical, in the sense that there seems to be recognition that housing is a long-term, it requires a long-term approach and consistent long-term approach. Housing also, and also when I use examples in Europe, there's been, to some extent, long-term history of formal housing being adopted. And as a result of that, they've learned over the time what works and doesn't work. All examples like in Germany, where, post the Second World War, they also had injection of significant government of sort of public investment to create an housing system that function. The UK is also an example of where people may have heard of the post-war housing boom in the UK, because soldiers were coming back for both the First and Second World War, and housing needed to be provided to them. And that period also has been, to date, the period in which we've had the most significant, we had a political consensus around the role of the public sector in initiating large-scale housing. So my sense is that the examples I give have benefited from history to some extent. But nonetheless, you've got outstanding examples like Singapore. But I think I would say that a lot of African countries, there's room for improvement. But within Africa, you've got examples like Egypt, where they've benefited from significant World Bank investment, and they've deployed those resources, I think, to initiate large-scale or volume housing, and the results are there too as well. And also South Africa, they've got its issues, but they also they adopted a number of approaches from the UK, and there's a foundation there, not perfect, because there's still significant issues there, that is miles ahead of a number of countries such as Nigeria.
I would say I'm optimistic that countries in Africa and other emerging economies can eventually catch up to where other nations have had the experience so far. And just staying on that note, there's no doubt that there is importance in targeted subsidy systems for lower income households. Can you elaborate on why subsidies are essential and how they can be effectively targeted?
Thank you, Favor. I mean, the reality, as I think for Africa, as I always remind people, is that the majority of the population are living in accommodation. The majority are earning very low incomes, and I would say a lot of people, significant population, are working in the informal sector. But I must say, working in the informal sector doesn't necessarily mean that people are poor, but nonetheless, there's a significant population that are not able to afford from their household income enough to pay for decent housing. So low cost housing is generally too expensive for many households. And therefore, either through because of the low and irregular incomes, whether it's also through limited access to credit or mortgages, and I think I've mentioned how expensive mortgages are, or the unaffordability of mortgages. And also, in some cases, because of the way housing is capital intensive, the high upfront costs, whether it's land, deposit, and fees. So without subsidies, the poorest will be locked out of formal housing and will be forced into what we unfortunately have at the moment, a significant number of people living in informal settlements or overcrowding, poor quality, overcrowded rentals. The other reason is why subsidies required is market failure in the housing sector. The market, I always, about 2 weeks ago, there was a property expo that was targeting Africans in the diaspora, and some of the real estate developers that came to pitch for that exhibition, the prices of some of the housing that were being pitched was unbelievable. I mean, there were plots of land going up in certain places in Lagos for, I think, 400 million naira. That's just for the plot of land. God knows how much it's going to cost to build them. And that is the reality, that it's a market, it's a failed market. And as a result of that, it typically caters to upper income groups. And partly also because, and that's also because construction and financing costs are too high, so developers will move to higher income projects other than low cost housing, and because also low income demand is seen as risky and unbankable. So subsidies do help to correct market distortions and de-risk investments, to encourage into pro-housing. I think it's well known that housing has social and economic impact, and it improves health, school performance, and everything else. So there's an argument that targeted subsidies will help unlock public benefits beyond the individual's households. Um, we all live in societies where, though there's inequality, social inequalities, that shouldn't stop us from aspiring to close the inequality gap. And I think any sort of healthy society or healthy country should aspire to ensure that its vulnerable populations, whether it's people with disabilities, displaced families, or whatever, are not left behind, and they have to be part of the um, society. Everybody needs to have a stake in the society, and also, let's be honest, if we want to avoid social um, um, social rupture in the future, then the housing needs of all the population, especially the young people, will need to be addressed. And my sense is that where currently the market or the financial system is not working, then you need some sort of subsidy for that.
Okay, Favour, there's a lot to unpack there. What are some of your highlights so far from what Olu has said?
Yes, and just as I said in the beginning, our affordable housing mini series has been a learning process, and today's episode is not an exception at all. And I think for me, I really enjoyed the holistic view Olu takes in understanding affordable housing, because at the end of the day, we discovered that it's not just about housing, but rather how housing affects other aspects of life and the economy. For instance, in creating more jobs and in construction and other aspects. So I thought it was really cool that we could see that, okay, it's not just housing. When we say affordable housing, we have to we have to understand the possibility that it affects other aspects, and that's why it's such an important focus area. And then the important roles policies play, I think it's something that we have discussed in previous episodes, but just understanding that policies play a crucial role in shaping a strong and resilient ecosystem. And for those policies to be really effective, there's need to consider, and I'm quoting Olu here when he says the technical, financial, and regulatory realities that are needed to deliver affordable housing at scale. And I think another thing which was also funny for me was just the fact that the government must be a leader in mobilizing the sector. And I said funny because Olu didn't catch his breath before answering, and said, yes, no matter the role that other institutions play, the government has to be the ringleader. And that's just because that they have the unique they are in a unique position to set the vision for affordable housing and then run with it. And I would say another surprising point for me was definitely when he spoke about PPPs. I was very taken aback at that, because we imagine when we talked about the Selcott episode, it was PPPs that built an airport. But in affordable housing, we are learning that is a different story. And that's usually because there tends to be an over-reliance on the private sector, and then there's not enough incentives for them. And so they take a step back, and then, as he said, we see rarely successful projects when it comes to affordable housing using PPPs. And so those were just really fascinating subjects for me. What about you, Richard?
Yeah, Favour. Well, Favour, I think those insights are really well put forward by you in terms of, those were important things in what he said, particularly on that last point you said around the private sector. There's a way he couched it. He said, the private sector doesn't show up for low-income housing. Like, naturally, the private sector doesn't show up. Like, so you've got this area of non-interest, and therefore the role of government is to create interest in something which naturally there wouldn't be interest in. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk earlier in sort of focusing on, Olu did a great job in setting out affordable housing as a basic right, as opposed to, it wasn't just about the jobs that are created from a vibrant construction industry, although that is really can be a really powerful economic force. But it's that idea of almost of, it being a basic right for individuals to have, a dignified home, something where they can go back to, which has the facilities for health, education in their communities. And I think that's a really nice way to center this mini series, because it is a basic right, and it is something that would not necessarily be provided to the standard, to the volume, to the scale required if just left to the markets, if just left to the private sector. And therefore the guiding hand of government, the sort of the gentle gardener that comes in and intervenes, because it's not, with all of these things, it's not saying about, government must go and build, let's employ lots of civil servants to start building houses, but it's being very deliberate about the approach to encourage those houses to be built. And he talks about the Iron Lady. He talks about Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, Favour. And I know this is before your time, but if you know anything about Margaret Thatcher, she was not a big person for the role of the state. She was not a big person for, in fact, her coming into power was a reaction to what had been seen as a very state-driven system on the economy, and she was in a way the antidote to that kind of style of government and style of economic management. Yet still, within all of this, Olu manages to find not a passive form of government, but a very active form of government. Even if government is not financing the houses, it's trying to draw private investment in there. Even if government is not building the houses themselves, because of course there's a private construction sector which is doing that. What it is doing is it's regulating and it's subsidizing and it's attracting finance, and it's being very active in that space. And you know, when most people think back at the 1980s and Margaret Thatcher, you don't think of state intervention, but there was a lot of state intervention that came through that. It was just done in a certain way. And I think there are lessons from that in terms of you can't hope to solve the affordable housing crisis globally through being passive as a government. You can't just hope it's gonna, you know, that there's just going to be a blockchain solution that's going to mean you just have to sit back. You've got to be active. You've got to be a steward, and you've got to ensure that these other parts of the ecosystem can come into play. You know, just like when we spoke with Glenn around the blockchain side, he knows he needs an interested regulator to enable what he's doing. He needs them to be engaged and to say, yeah, you know what, this is going to be a bit uncomfortable for us, but we're going to allow it to happen because we see the prize of what this can release, and therefore he needs them to engage. And so likewise, I think Olu is right to bring that focus here as well, that it needs to be some sort of guiding hand in stewardship.
Yes, I think I like that phrasing, that government has to be the guiding hand. And that was his emphasis, actually, that we are saying that government must be the leader, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be the biggest contributor, but they must be the leader and coordinator, because they have, as I said earlier, that unique role of setting the vision, and then it's now their job to ensure that other players within the industry can now properly run with the vision that they have set.
Yeah, and I think another reflection I had from what he said was just when we talk about affordable housing at scale, you know, it's very tempting to think about the sort of the millions of houses that are required, right, and needed, and that almost like magically as if we can find one aspect of this and if we tweak it, it's going to unlock a million houses. But I think what Olu does really nicely is he just frames it in terms of, you know, what's required in order to build 1,000 houses a year is a degree of capability, a degree of mindfulness and planning, which is not insignificant. And that's for 1,000 houses a year. And we know the problem is much larger than that. So it puts it into perspective, not to say that it can't be done or that we can never unlock housing at the scale required, but that it has to be done with intention. It has to be done with a plan, with coordination, with all the things that are required from good governance. And that doesn't put it out of reach for many countries, but it does mean it's got to be done deliberately.
I think that's the key aspect, that it has to be done deliberately. There's just a need for intentionality when it comes to the affordable housing ecosystem. And that's what this episode focused on. How can the government be intentional? How can they take more intentional steps? And what policies and institutional reform would look like when they are being that intentional?
The other thing, Favor, I would say is I'm instinctively against subsidies, right? I've seen so many examples of subsidies which distort, subsidies that destroy rather than build, subsidies that end up doing an awful lot more damage, cause a lot more waste, a lot more harm than good. And yet, I think Olu makes a really strong case for them in the case of affordable housing, because when you start from looking at affordable housing as a right, and then you also know that for many people, they can't afford basic affordable housing to the level required that gives dignity, that gives prospects for, being able to tap into communities, have good health, welfare, well-being, all the rest of it, then by very definition of that, some sort of government subsidy would be required. right? Now, the degree to whether that could be sustainable or not is another question. But thinking through, how much money has been spent over the past 30 years in Nigeria on a fuel subsidy, which overwhelmingly has gone to richer people in the country. Why? Because richer people have cars. They travel more in their vehicles. They go larger distances. When I was in Nigeria, I had a car. I went to a filling station. I got the subsidy. Should I, as a international, a member of the diplomatic community, should I be tapping into Nigeria's hard-earned resources to make my fuel cheaper? I don't think so. I didn't expect that. That wasn't an entitlement that I thought I was due. But a fuel subsidy is blind to who you are, what you've done. It just says, if you want to buy fuel, I'm going to make it cheaper for you. And it's going to come at the expense of what the country has saved. Now, would I prefer for Nigeria to have had a subsidy that was focused on affordable housing, which was actually delivering to people who just couldn't afford basic level of accommodation, rather than helping, I don't even want to count up the value of that subsidy that over the 10 years I've spent in Nigeria, I would have taken that money would be better spent on someone else. Absolutely, it would have been. Would it be better spent on affordable housing? Yeah, I think it would have been. So whilst I'm instinctively against subsidies, I can see from what Olu says the case for it in the context of something which should be seen as a basic right. What do you think, Favour? I know you always, if anyone who touches Nigeria's fuel subsidy always gets slammed down because it's seen as this kind of, for Nigerians, it's like your version of the National Health Service. It's like, we must have cheap fuel. What's your take on this?
I think it's too late to insist on subsidy, considering the fact that they have been removed. And yes, my initial reaction would be to talk about the hardship that has come out of that removal, because we know that when fuel is just one point in the dominoes. So I've seen a lot of domino effects, the rising inflation and everything. But getting more understanding of actually how subsidies worked, and we understood that not the removal of subsidy isn't the issue. The main issue why we have had so much negative effect has been there was no proper, it wasn't taken the step wasn't taken properly, to put it mildly. And so removing subsidy, of course, it's needed so our economy, we can actually understand the growth that we are seeing. But coming back to today's episode, you are totally right. I loved the point that Olu made, because his emphasis was on the fact that subsidies are essential in the informal sector as a way to close the inequality gap. And I thought that was really powerful, because we're talking about, he said there are people that are in the economy that won't be able to get access to affordable housing otherwise, except there's this subsidy. So I think you are right. It's just a matter of reframing. What are the things that we are subsidizing, and where would this money be better spent? Because I know I once had the joke that if you could choose between a car or a house, that you should choose a car because you can't drive around your house. But I do not agree with that analysis at all. I think you should always choose a house above a car, because you always go have somewhere to sleep, no matter the rain, no matter the sun. If your car stops moving, where will you go? When the weather is cold, you can't survive in your car. And so, yes, just using your analogy, maybe instead of fuel subsidy, it would have been better placed in the affordable housing. But those are just thoughts for now. But yeah, it was really amazing to hear Olu's explanation and analysis of subsidies within the affordable housing ecosystem.
You know what? I sort of knew that talking about Nigeria's fuel subsidy would trigger you. I thought that would. I think that would be the same for any Nigerian. That talking about the fuel subsidy one way or another. I do believe, though, that fuel subsidy is not dead. It's been tried to be killed off so many times over the years, and it keeps rearing its ugly head back again. So whilst. Yeah, I mean, I think the jury's still out as to whether that fuel subsidy has truly gone, even if fuel prices have skyrocketed. But yeah, I mean, I like your analogy on, car or a house. I would agree with you. I don't think anyone wants to be sleeping in their car. Things have usually gone quite badly if that happens. So yeah, I'm with you on Team House. Okay, let's go back to what Olu has to say in the second part of his interview. Thank you, Olu. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about your experience and your projects in Rwanda, because I understand that some of your work there maybe looking at exactly these kind of issues around subsidies and how that can be made more sustainable and trying to solve the affordable housing challenges. So could you give us a bit of information about that project?
Okay, so we're currently working on we've just completed feasibility studies and we're moving to implementation of an informal a redevelopment of an informal settlement in Rwanda called Mpazi, and the idea is to, over a period of 5 years, build about 4,000 to 5,000 units. But what we're trying to execute there first is to retain the informal settled dwellers by building, in exchange for the value of their existing homes, we provide free housing. So effectively, if your house is worth, I don't know, $10,000, you get a one-bedroom unit. If it's worth 20,000, you get two-bedroom. But the idea is to retain them and address the traditional problem of displacement that takes place in this sort of regeneration, where people get monetary compensation and then you end up finding yourself that they end up going to create another slum elsewhere. And also because there's a recognition that there's even though from outside we see them as slums in terms of physical quality of the accommodation, but they're generally thriving urban communities. So it's important to retain that sense of activity, economic activity taking place in some of those neighborhoods. So that's one way in which the free housing is being used somewhat as a sort of a targeted subsidy for the people currently living there. But in exchange for that, we're also, obviously, because this particular informal settlement is very near the city center, we want to maximize that location so that there will be increased density and introduced mixed use, other mixed uses like a higher value residential properties, commercial uses, shops, and other facilities to maximize the location of that particular slum settlement, or informal settlement, if I may refer it as such. And the idea also then is that you blend, because there's going to be some viability gaps. We attract impact investors because this is going to be sustainable development. It's going to be green. You attract impact investors that will and concessionary finance to close the gap in the early years. But because what we're doing in the feasibility studies to recognize that in the early years there's going to be some viability gaps, but over a period of time, we with the increase in the value of the neighborhood, that viability gap reduces. But the mechanisms we're now introducing is that we're trying to design a vehicle, a non-for-profit vehicle, which would be the depository of any concessional finance or subsidy. Because one of the challenges with this sort of model in the past is a fear that if you introduce capital subsidies into project, if it goes to the private sector, obviously there's a potential leakage. But what we're proposing in this project is that the subsidy will sit with the non-for-profit vehicle, because it's not issuing dividends. Of course, it makes profit in terms of the joint venture arrangement it will be doing with private sector players, but that's its allocation of profit gets recycled back into to build more homes. So that's the approach in where we're using a combination of subsidy, blended finance, private sector partnership in order to, but underpinned by strong institutions to hopefully transform a strategically situated neighborhood.
Olu, I think the pattern I'm beginning to see emerge here is the importance of understanding context as well as learning lessons as we go through this affordable housing ecosystem. And just to pivot a bit, institutional affordable rental housing isn't widespread in Africa. So what do you believe are the barriers that prevent its adoption at scale?
Good question. I mean, there are a number of reasons. I think weak regulatory and legal frameworks is one of the reasons. Many countries lack clear rental housing policies, or when it exists, it's not properly enforced. I'm sure we're all aware of cases where the disputes, tenants are evicted without without any sort of proper dispute resolution mechanisms. And the other side of coin in terms of landlord as well is it's not unusual for it to also be extremely difficult to evict tenants as for non-payment. I think inadequate financial incentives. As we all know, rental housing has longer payback periods so it requires patient capital. And there are few incentives to attract private capital or private developers. Um, as an asset class, it doesn't compare favorably in terms of yield to the sort of addiction to government borrowings or government stock or bonds that a lot of pension institutions or banks and all the institutional financial institutions are wedded to, especially in Africa. So um, that sort of straightforward comparison also act as a barrier, although the case we also make is always that you cannot just look at the yields alone. You also need to look at the capital, the appreciation of the value of the property over a period of years. And if you're a pension institution that you're thinking long term, the rental, if the rent is linked to some form of inflationary increase, is also a better investment compared to government borrowing. But that's another issue entirely. Again, I think it faces the challenges of the underdeveloped housing finance systems as well, and that also acts as a sort of a barrier. Normally, large scale rental housing generally should be near urban centers where rental demand is highest, but generally we find that land values are very high in these areas. So service plots for high density multi-unit developments are very rare. So so those are some of the reasons. And then also, as you well know, there's also cultural preference for ownership in a lot of parts of Africa, and then the final point I'll make is that there's sort of lack of government-led support for rental housing. So that also, because any of the announcements you hear of is more around homes that will be bought with mortgages, not enough about actually how do we recognize the fact that most people in urban centers or urban cities in Africa are renting in poor quality accommodation, and actually part of the solution has to be rental housing, not just home ownership programs that are not accessible for majority of the population.
Thank you, Olu. Are there international models on renting affordable housing that Africa could try and adopt or adjust or trial, which haven't already been tried?
Yeah. I give example of I think Vienna model where I said 60% of Viennese residents, I think, live in public or subsidized rental housing. A number of them are mixed incomes, so tenants of all incomes, they live in the same buildings. They're examples of use of non-for-profit organizations that the government invest in or provide cheap finance and provide tax incentives for. Um, even the UK is a good example of council housing or municipal authority housing. Now, of course, there are issues about how some of these have been managed, but the idea of municipal authorities building housing for rent, it's not unusual, or even state government bodies building housing for rent. So insofar they set up properly, in my view, and that setting up properly include government making land available or working in partnership with non-for-profit developers, providing the right cross subsidies, ensuring the right rental framework or legal framework. So those would be some of my examples. I think that needs to be in place. But South Africa too also got some examples of housing associations that have been set up that are managing substantial rental housing. And I think there are one or two examples in South Africa as well of private sector REITs that have been created that has gone to raise capital from institutional investors and use the REIT vehicle to finance and fund rental housing.
So you have worked on initiatives like Green City Kigali and the other one you mentioned in Rwanda. So what are key lessons from these projects that other African countries can learn in order to create sustainable, scalable housing solutions?
Okay, I mean, my like everything else, it always starts with planning and framework. I mean, the green agenda in Rwanda has been largely successful, at least in terms of attracting external funds, primarily because they've set out a clear framework of how green housing wants they want it is to be stimulated or supported in the country. So there's a lot of more planning that has gone into it. They've set up institutions like Fonewa, which is I think it's the agency responsible for green and energy that has a clear role of acting as advocate and also accessing institutional investments outside of Rwanda for green agenda. So there's a sort of a clear policy framework developed. There's a sort of institutional setup, in order to achieve or deliver the policy, and increasingly now they are piloting the Green City Kigali, which we had the opportunity to help set up as a non-for-profit company that will now pilot. So there's a 600 hectare project that they want to develop. And the Green City Kigali, with funding from the German Development Bank, KfW, are now going to pilot about 20 hectares. And so that sort of demonstration, testing, and learning from it are some of the features, in my view. And also, it was an opportunity to build a capacity of local SMEs, local developers, to understand what's required, and also learning really about, because one of the challenges, as you well know, around the green agenda in Africa is that people always pose the question, I've not got a normal housing or proper shelter to live in. Why should I invest in a green housing that may or may not cost me a bit extra? So, but my thinking is that developments that is happening around, Nigeria. I was in Nigeria recently, and I think I shared this story on LinkedIn and got a lot of engagement on it. As I was speaking to I went to see one of my aunties that is, she's probably about 85 years old. And I found that in a house. She had invested in the inverter, solar panels, and everything else. So I thought, oh gosh, better late than ever. She's now a climate activist and whatever. She looked at me in this way and said, "Look, man, what's happening here is that the cost of fuel has gone up, and the reality is that people are going off grid in response to that." And I think that might be one of the drivers that we probably did not um, totally realize could be one of the drivers of moving people to more green and sustainable agenda.
Oh, thanks, Olu. And yeah, the cost of fuel globally, I mean, and the way that solar panels have got so inexpensive now. I mean, you don't need to be a green advocate in order to see the sense in investing in those things, particularly when the grid isn't reliable, as in the case in Nigeria. But looking ahead, Olu, what really excites you about the prospects of affordable and sustainable housing in Africa? What are the things that really which you really see these are the things to be optimistic about?
I think for me, I just love the fact, the energy that comes whenever you go to an Africa, in spite of, I mean, so people like me, we can do all the analysis of what's wrong and what needs to be fixed. But the reality is that the young people are trying to find solutions. So there's stuff around property tech that is happening. People are looking at the stuff happening with fintech. How can we use some of that technology to undertake credit assessment for informal workers, because people are buying stuff, they're raising money. There's a sort of digital footprint that is emerging. So there's some learnings that could cut across in terms of underwriting. Of course, I know the banks do take their time, but I can see over a period of time, some of that technology platforms and the learnings from that could go into designing of housing finance product, be it housing microfinance, that is better matched with the way people actually build. The reality is that we could articulate the fact that not enough formal housing is being built, that is being led by the state. But the reality is that on the ground, there's a lot of incremental housing taking place where people put money together to buy a plot of land, put money together to put the foundation in place. Of course, it takes longer period of time, and at times people just decide, look, I've got it weatherproof. I move into it. But the reality, for me, I think that is where we should be thinking about designing financial product that makes that quicker and easier and faster for people to build. So I'm excited about that. I think the conversation we just had about off-grid housing, solar energy, it's quite exciting in the sense that economic realities are also going to introduce more sustainable housing. Then there's all the things like 3D construction that I've seen examples of somewhere in Kenya, and that if it can be scaled up. There's always people selling to me, trying to get me to vet their and validate their building technologies. And so the number of times people are always telling me about new building technology. I mean, I've not found one yet that deliver, but there's an aspiration around that. And then lastly, I just think politicians too they realize that actually we need to fix the housing crisis, because I think this issue of urbanization is not going to go away. And hopefully that will lead people to start seeing housing as an infrastructure, not just something else to be done.
Thank you very much, Olu. Just one last question. If you could give policymakers across Africa one piece of advice regarding affordable housing, what would it be?
I think it's probably my last point, which is the fact that they should see housing or affordable housing as an infrastructure, not just something you do as a charity or social objective, because they just need to treat it, in my view, as an essential infrastructure, um, not as a sort of social afterthought. And I think that's what because, and this matters because whether it's roads, powers, or water, affordable housing, like all those things, underpins everything. it allows for economic productivity. It addresses public health. It addresses education and climate resilience. So if that mindset changes, I can see how that fits into improvement in strategies and master plans and budgeting and coordination across ministries to build a functioning ecosystem.
Well, that was Ulu's interview. Favor, what's your takeaway? What's your key conclusion from all of this?
All right. Yes, this has been a really insightful episode. And I think for me, just hearing Olu discuss the project in Rwanda, and all I could hear was just the way that they were reimagining what housing development can be. I mean, any movie you watch, any news you hear about the big developers that come and then displace people and build shopping complex in places of natural resources and things like that. But from what Olu told us, we are learning that it can be different. Instead of pushing them out, instead of pushing these settlers out of where they are living, where most of them it's a home, you build for them, and then you retain the core sense of what these communities represent. And I think that was it struck a chord for me and is a good emphasis of the Flywheel Economics principle. We always talk about the fact that policymakers, and in this case the government, are to be gardeners. And what does a good gardener do? He doesn't come and say, oh, no, I don't like the color of this flower, or this doesn't fit my aesthetics, this doesn't fit my vibe, and then uproots. No, what a good gardener does, he looks at what is growing. He looks at, okay, how can this be better? What needs pruning? What needs watering? And you begin to now cultivate what works instead of forcibly uprooting. Because when you forcibly uproot, there's going to be negative consequences. If big developers come and build, they are applauded and say, oh, there's now more houses. But what about people that have been displaced? What about people that can no longer afford to stay where they have been staying, maybe for years? But I love this story of what is happening in Rwanda, because it shows another possibility that probably hasn't been considered before. So what did you think, Richard?
Oh, those are really insightful comments, Favor. I agree with them all. What I would say, the bit that struck me from that Rwanda model was the smartness that Ulu has in terms of putting a not-for-profit, an NGO, at the center of all of it, recognizing that exactly what he said in the first part of his interview, right? The private sector doesn't show up for low-income housing. So he knows that private sector by itself is not going to solve all these problems. It doesn't have the incentives to. And yes, government can provide those incentives if it's done in the right way. But the idea that you can have this catalytic not-for-profit in the middle of all of this, which can partner with the developers, that can reinvest the profit. So it's not saying that there's no profit made, but that profit can be recycled into creating more affordable housing. And yes, of course, Favor, the thing you pointed out, which is, the slum dwellers that are in the land already. It's not like they're forced out and luxury housing is put in and they're forgotten about, but they trade that in for accommodation which is dignified, which is they have something in return. They're part of it. They're benefiting from it. So, and then just to respond, because I think I love that you spoke to the Flywheel economic principles, and I would like to build on that as well. I think it is very possible to have an ecosystem. We use the ecosystem as the metaphor, right, for the economy. And we sort of say, look, economies are ecosystems. And so it is entirely possible that you end up with an ecosystem that isn't working for everyone, that there are gaps, there are deficiencies in that ecosystem. And the idea of the Flywheel economics principles is not that you just say, well, that's the ecosystem, just leave it as it is. There is a role for intervention. There is a role for stewardship. And sometimes that intervention needs to be quite dramatic or quite drastic in what it is, although it shouldn't be done very frequently and it should be applied very sparingly. But with something like affordable housing, where it isn't being provided at the scale or level required, it could need some quite deep intervention. And I think that's exactly what we see in the affordable housing space is that it is failing. The ecosystems aren't naturally providing this, and there therefore needs to be this clever, deliberate, active, proactive intervention, and governments need to be part of that. But also there's other parts of a supporting ecosystem as well, just like what Olu is doing with that not-for-profit organization, and how that could be catalytic in really galvanizing the different parts of the ecosystem there as well. So yes, it needs to be led by government. We need the government as a gardener, government as a steward, government as the guiding hand in to help this all come together. But where government perhaps doesn't always have the capacity or sometimes even the vision to do that stuff, there can be other players in the system that help them come to that, right? That not-for-profit is great. They're not going to feel threatened by, a government is not going to feel threatened by a not-for-profit the way they would with a private sector company, because they know its motives are there not for profit, not for lining the pockets of a few people, but that there is some larger social benefit around that. And that is an easier partner for them to have, easier for trust. And where you've got a good government, like the Rwanda government, they have strong capabilities, strong willingness and determination in many aspects of their economic development. They've shown that they are very focused and can deliver. So when you have a government partner like that, and you bring a not-for-profit which has that kind of vision of what the affordable housing can be, I'm sure we'll see a lot of progress there, and I'm sure it will be very successful, even though this is not an easy space to play in at all. Any final thoughts from you, Favour, before we wrap up?
Yes, I think it's just a matter of, this is a mini series. We have to remind ourselves that, and so far the mini series, I feel like we have gotten consistent points that come up, which is the fact that innovation is key. And even when we are saying, the government is the major player here, but the government also has to innovate as well. Just understanding, okay, how can we do this better? And then collaboration, no one player. That's why the team of this affordable housing miniseries has been the pieces, the players and solutions. There's not just one player. And so collaboration is key, whether that's the government, and we are seeing the not for profit as well, and then the private sector. And just once again, just throwing it back to our Flywheel Economics principles, that this is where the ecosystem comes in. And just as we would expect from a natural ecosystem, we're seeing that here in the affordable housing, and we're really taking a lot of points, and it's very fascinating to see the similarities. And so this has been an awesome ride, episode 5, and I'm really, really happy about today's episode and just learning a lot.
Yeah, and deeply grateful for Olu for joining us and sharing his insights from his 30 years or so working in the sector. I mean, he's got such a wealth of experience, and his insights, they come across to me that they're really on the money here in terms of what needs to happen, what needs to change. And like I said, I'm optimistic for his initiative in Rwanda. I think it could be a really nice model for the way forward. He's bringing a lot of experience internationally of what works, what hasn't worked, and he's bringing that together, and wish him the very best of luck with it. And would you like to do the concluding remarks, Faber? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we've really had some amazing guests, all experts in their field, and Olu was no exception. So thank you very much, Olu, for sharing your expertise, your experience, your insights with us. We really appreciate you joining us on the show. And that's a wrap on today's episode, which saw a deep dive into the role of government, policies, and institutions within the affordable housing sector. And for our dear listeners, thank you so much once again for following us. We are so happy that you have stuck with us through these 5 episodes so far of the Affordable Housing miniseries. We hope you enjoyed the ride and learned something new today. And don't forget that if you're eager to learn more about the fascinating topics that we cover, you can head over to our website at flywheeleconomics.com for additional resources. And if you have any thoughts on this episode, let us know on social media. Flywheel Economics is our handle across X, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We'll be back with another fascinating topic for our next episode. And as always, thanks for listening. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics Podcast.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.